There is a particular kind of humiliation that arrives without warning and settles without sound. That is the kind I want to tell you about tonight, my friends. Pull your chair a little closer to the fire. This one takes patience to understand, and I promise you, it is worth understanding. Aldermere Hall, North Yorkshire, October 1817. The dinner was proceeding exactly as Miss Iris Standish had known it would, which was to say, not well, and not honestly, and with the specific quality of discomfort that comes from a room full of people, choosing not to name the thing everyone in it can plainly see. Lord Theodore Ashcroft was present. He was always present. He was that kind of man, warm and easy in a room the way a fire is easy in a hearth, the kind of presence that makes a gathering feel more alive simply by arriving in it. He was 28 years old and genuinely kind and absolutely, unmistakably not looking at Iris. He was looking at Miss Georgiana Linton. Miss Linton was seated 3 places down on the opposite side of the long mahogany table, between her mother and Colonel Whitfield, engaged in a conversation about the autumn harvest that had nothing interesting in it whatsoever, and Lord Theodore was attending to it as though it were the most remarkable account of grain yields he had ever encountered in his life. Iris had noticed this on the second day of her visit. She was, by training and by nature, a woman who noticed things. Her father, Robert Standish, publisher, Bostonian by birth, Londoner by necessity, had raised her on the principle that the most useful skill a person can possess is accurate observation. And he had been right, as he was right about most things. She noticed the way Lord Theodore's attention travelled across the table like water finding its level. She noticed the way Miss Linton's hands went still when he spoke. She noticed, with the clear-eyed honesty of a woman who had come to Aldermere Hall, with no illusions, the triangular geometry of 3 people pointed in directions that would never quite align. She had been at Aldermere Hall 10 days. She had come with her father's hopes and a trunk of sensible dresses and the clear understanding. She always insisted on clear understandings. It was a quality her father admired, and her mother had occasionally found inconvenient, that she was here to be considered as a match for Lord Theodore Ashcroft. The families had agreed. The visit was arranged. The only element that had not been arranged was Lord Theodore's heart, which had apparently made its own arrangements some time ago, and was not available for renegotiation. At the far end of the table, the Earl of Aldermere sat, and said almost nothing. He said almost nothing as he had said almost nothing in 10 days. Dorian Ashcroft, the 5th Earl of Aldermere, was 35 years old, had been a widower for 3 years, and the county families found him difficult and cold. Iris had heard this from Lady Maud Ashcroft, his mother, on the first afternoon, delivered as a kind of preemptive apology. He is not easy in company. He never has been. Do not take it personally, my dear. Iris had not taken it personally. She had watched him instead. He was not cold. That was the first thing she understood. He was precise. There was a difference, and it was the difference between a man who felt nothing and a man who felt everything quite exactly and saw no reason to perform what he felt for an audience that had not earned it. She had seen this most clearly on the 6th morning when she had gone to the conservatory at dawn because she could not sleep, and had found, to her genuine astonishment, a botanical collection of extraordinary qualities, equally extraordinary disarray. The specimens were real, some of them rare. A few she recognized from illustrated plates in her father's publishing catalogue, and they were mislabeled. Not carelessly, systematically, as though whoever had relabeled them in roughly 1809 had been working from a reference that was itself incorrect, and the error had simply propagated forward through every subsequent catalogue entry since. She had stood in the early light among the ferns and orchids and carefully tended camellias and thought, someone built this collection with real knowledge, and then someone else described it incorrectly, and no one has noticed. She had begun to make notes. She had her father's habits. The Earl had found her there on the 8th morning. She had not heard him come in. She had been cross-referencing a specimen tag against the notation in her small leather notebook, examining a cattleya orchid that was labeled as a dendrobium, which it very much was not. And she had looked up and found him standing by the glass door with a pair of pruning shears in his hand and an expression she could not immediately read. He had looked at her notebook. He had looked at the specimen. He had looked at her. He had not said a word, which by then she was beginning to understand as his version of saying a great deal. He had gone to the far end of the conservatory and begun working with the camellia cuttings, and that was that. She had returned to the orchid. They had been in the conservatory together for nearly an hour in complete silence, and when she finally rose to go in to breakfast, he had looked up from the camellias and nodded once. The specific nod of two people who have shared a space without inconveniencing each other and found the arrangement entirely satisfactory. She had thought about that nod for the rest of the day. Now at the dinner table, Mrs. Portia Covington, wife of the Covington estate, prominent fixture in the county's social machinery, and a woman who had arrived at her opinions early in life and saw no reason to revisit them, said something. She said it in the particular register of the socially confident, not loud enough to require acknowledgement, not quiet enough to be missed. It was the kind of remark calibrated for maximum reach and minimum accountability. She smiled when she said it, and she looked at Iris when she looked away. It was about Iris's father, about his origins, about the trade of publishing, which Mrs. Covington described as not quite the thing what expected to fight at thing represented at the table of the Earl of Aldermere. Though of course one understood that times were changing, and families did what they must. Iris had received remarks of this kind before. She had been receiving them since the age of 16, when her father had moved them from Boston to London, and she had entered English drawing rooms for the first time and discovered that certain rooms held her origins against her, before she had spoken a single word. She had developed, over the years, a particular capacity for other remarks without visible fracture. She thought of it as composure. Her father, who was honest, called it armor. She looked at the candles. The Earl of Aldermere set down his wineglass. It was a small sound, just glass on linen, but there was something in the quality of it, the deliberateness of it, the specific timing, that made the table become aware of itself. "You are mistaken, Mrs. Covington," the Earl said. His voice was quiet. It was always quiet. Quiet in the way of a man who speaks less often than other men, and is therefore heard, when he finally speaks, with the full weight of the silence he has not broken until now. The table went still. Robert Standish, the Earl continued, without raising his voice, without any performance of authority whatsoever, published the revised botanical taxonomy that corrected 40 years of misclassification across 3 major genera. The volume is in my library. It is one of the more useful books I own. He picked up his wineglass. I do not believe the enterprise that produced it requires your qualification. He drank. He set the glass down. He returned to his plate and said nothing further. The silence that followed was absolute. Colonel Whitfield developed a sudden and consuming interest in his soup. Miss Linton looked at the tablecloth. Lady Maud, at the head of the table, had the expression of a woman watching her elder son surprise her, which was, Iris thought, not her first time wearing that expression. Iris looked at the candles. She did not look at the Earl. She did not trust herself in that particular moment to look at the Earl with an expression that did not reveal what she was feeling, which was something she had not anticipated feeling at a dinner table in North Yorkshire. Something that had no clean name yet, but was precise and warm, and in the very best way, inconvenient. Mrs. Covington was not invited to dine at Aldermere Hall for the remainder of the season. The Earl made the statement once in the form of a conspicuous absence, and did not elaborate. He never did. The morning after, Lord Theodore came to find her in the conservatory. She had half expected him. She had been expecting something for 3 days, ever since she had overheard. She had not meant to overhear. She had simply been very quiet among the camellias, which was a habit. A conversation between Theodore and his mother that had ended with Lady Maud saying his name in the particular tone of a woman who has realized that something she arranged cannot hold. Theodore arrived with the expression of a man who has rehearsed a speech and is no longer certain it is the right one. "Miss Standish," he said, "Iris, I owe you an apology." "Yes," she said. He stopped. He had expected more. She indicated the bench beside the camellia wall, and he sat, and she sat across from him with her notebook in her lap and looked at him with the direct, patient attention she brought to things she needed to understand completely. "Tell me," she said, "what you actually wish to say." He told her. It took less time than either of them expected. He was a decent man, and he was in love with Georgiana Linton, and he had been for 2 years, and the families had arranged something he had not had the courage to refuse, and he was sorry. "I know about Miss Linton," Iris said. "I noticed on the second day." The silence that followed was the silence of a man discovering that his secret was never won. "You knew," he said. "I noticed. There is a difference." She glanced at the mislabeled orchid on the shelf behind him. "Theodore, do you wish to marry me?" He looked at his hands. He looked at the glass ceiling. He looked at her, finally, with the expression of a man who has been asked to be honest by a woman who already knows the answer, and is simply giving him the room to say it himself. "No," he said, quietly, with the particular relief of someone who has put down something that was never theirs to carry. "Thank you," she said. He blinked. "That is all you have to say. It is the true answer to a true question. I prefer it to 3 more weeks of something that serves neither of us." She set her notebook aside. "You should tell Miss Linton. Whatever comes next, she deserves to know where she stands." He looked at her for a long moment, with something that was close to genuine admiration. "You are remarkably steady," he said. "I have had 9 days to prepare," she said. "You have had 1 night." He left. She sat alone in the conservatory, among the mislabeled specimens and the camellias that needed winter wrapping, and the long grey light coming flat through the glass roof, and she thought about what she would tell her father, and what would be said in London, and what the story would be. She thought, "I am 27 years old, and I have been brought to this house to consider a man who was already considering someone else, and the arrangement is dissolving, and that will be the story people tell." She thought, that is not the whole story. She was still sitting with that thought when the conservatory door opened and the Earl of Aldermere came in. He stopped when he saw her. She stopped in the process of standing when she saw him. They looked at each other across the length of the glass room. "Stay," he said, "not a command, a permission." She stayed. He went to the camellia wall, his usual place, and he worked, and she worked, and the morning moved through the glass in long pale panels, and neither of them said anything for a long while. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of 2 people who have established, over 9 shared mornings, that silence between them is not absence. It is something else entirely. After a while she said, "You read my father's book." "I did," he said. "He will be pleased to know it." "I read it 3 times, the Earl said. He did not look up from the camellias. The revised classification of the Cattleya genus was the reason I recognized, years ago, that someone had mislabeled most of the East Wall collection in 1809. I simply did not know what the correct labels should be." He paused. "Until you came." She set her pencil down. He turned from the camellias. He looked at her with the direct grey eyes she had been trying, with moderate success, not to look at too directly for 10 days, and he said, without approach, without preamble, without the managed architecture of implication that other men of his position might have constructed, "I should like very much for you to stay. Not only because of the collection, though the collection genuinely needs you, because I have spent 10 days in the company of someone who sees what is actually there instead of what has been incorrectly labeled. And I am not willing to watch that walk out of this conservatory without saying something about it. He paused. I am saying something now. She was quiet for a moment. I have conditions, she said. Something moved across his face that was not quite a smile, but was unmistakably its neighbor. I would be surprised if you didn't. I want to correspond freely with my father. He is in London, and he is important to me. Of course, he said. And the East Wall collection. The recataloguing will take the better part of a winter, properly done. I will need a complete reference library and someone who can be trusted to source specimens for the classification gaps. I have both, he said, and I would like to help if you'll allow it. She looked at him. She thought about 9 mornings of silence that had not been indifference, and a dictatable and 5 words spoken quietly into a room that was performing cruelty, and a single nod at breakfast that had carried more weight than most declarations she had heard in her life. One more condition, she said. Name it. When you know something, say it. Once is enough. I am listening, but I need to know you will say it, and not assume I have heard. He held her gaze for a long moment. There is something I should have said 3 days ago. Say it now, she said. I love you, he said. I have been aware of that since the morning I found you arguing with the label on a Cattleya orchid as though it had done something personally offensive. I did not say it because I was waiting for a correct moment. And then I understood that there is no correct moment in a conservatory. There is simply the truth, or the absence of it. She looked at him. She thought about what it meant to be seen correctly, not improved, not arranged into a shape a room required, not assessed against a standard she hadn't set for herself, but seen as exactly what she was, which was the daughter of a man who published important books, and a woman who noticed things, and someone who had come to this house expecting one thing and found something else entirely, and had the good sense to recognize it when she found it. Yes, she said. Yes. Yes, she said again, to whatever you were going to ask next. My dear friends, pause here with me just a moment, because this is the part of the story I come back to most, not the proposal, though it was quiet and true and precisely right, not the 5 words at the dinner table, though those were the moment the county understood that something was shifting. What I think about is Iris Standish sitting alone in the conservatory. Theodore left, with the question of what the story would be, and deciding that it was not the whole story. She was right. She was sent to that house for a purpose that had already arranged itself in the wrong direction, and she arrived with clear eyes and no illusions, and what she found instead was a man who had read her father's work 3 times and kept it in his library and had noticed, long before she arrived, that someone had gotten the labels wrong. That is love, my friends. Not the arranged kind, the observing kind. If this story found its way to you tonight, I hope you'll stay with us here at Moonlight at Marlowe. There are more evenings by this fire, more stories of people who were very nearly missed by the happiness they deserved. Subscribe and come back. I will make sure you don't miss a single one. Robert Standish arrived on a Thursday in his good travelling coat, with the expression of a man who has received a letter and made a 2-day journey from London to assess the situation with his own eyes. He embraced Iris in the entrance hall of Aldermere Hall the way he had always embraced her, completely, without qualification, and she felt in it the particular relief of being known by someone who has always known you correctly. Tell me, he said. She told him everything. She did not omit the conservatory, or the 5 words at dinner, or the conditions she had stated. She did not omit anything, because her father had never required her to. He listened with the complete deliberate attention of a man who had made his living, listening more carefully than the next person. And when she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, he read the botanical taxonomy. 3 times, she said. He looked at her with the expression she loved best on his face, which was surprise moving cleanly into approval. "The Cattleya mislabeling," he said. "That correction was in the appendix. Most readers don't reach the appendix." "He noticed it before I arrived," she said. "He simply didn't know the correction." "But you did," her father said. "But I did," she said. He went to speak with the Earl of Aldermere. She went to the conservatory, naturally, because the conservatory was where she went when she needed to think clearly. She did not hear what passed between them. She read. The late autumn light came cold and flat through the glass. She thought about what it meant to be seen correctly, not managed, not corrected, simply seen as exactly what she was, which was more than sufficient, more than she had known before this October to look for. The conservatory door opened at 4 o'clock. The Earl came in. He did not go to the camellias. He came to where she was sitting, closer than he had stood in 10 days of shared mornings, and looked at her with the grey eyes that were not coldness but depth, and said without any management at all, "Your father asked me 4 questions. What did you answer?" "The truth," he said, "to all 4. He paused. "He asked whether I would value you correctly, not only in the first season, in all the seasons after." He looked at her steadily. "I told him that I have spent 10 days in the company of the only person who has ever corrected my conservatory, argued with my specimen labels, and told me a hard thing directly instead of arranging around it, and that the thought of all the seasons without that is not something I am prepared to accept." She stood. She set the notebook aside. "The east wall," she said. "I will need until March to finish the recataloguing properly." "I know," he said. "And you should write to my father regularly. He will want updates on the collection." "I intend to," said the Earl. "I believe he and I have a considerable amount to discuss about the appendix." "He will be insufferable about being right," she said. "So will I," he said. "We will manage each other." They married in December, in the chapel at Aldermere Hall. In the quiet way of 2 people who had found each other in a glass house in October, and required no occasion to confirm what had been true since the morning of the 8th day. Lord Theodore attended with Miss Georgiana Linton, who had by then accepted his proposal, and who wore the expression of a woman who has been waiting for something she had stopped permitting herself to hope for, and has had it arrive anyway. It was, Iris thought, the finest version of him she had seen, and she was genuinely glad of it. Lady Maud stood beside Robert Standish during the ceremony, and they were, by all observable evidence, in the middle of a conversation about property management and publishing, contracts that would continue well past the wedding breakfast and into the following spring. Mrs. Aldridge, the housekeeper, told the head groundsman the next morning that she had known how it would go from the day the Earl came in from the conservatory, with camellia cuttings on his coat, and sat down to breakfast with a quietness that was different from his usual quietness. The quietness, she said, of a man who has made a decision and is not going to unmake it. She was right. The East Wall collection was fully recatalogued by February, 2 weeks ahead of Iris's own estimate. The Earl wrote her father a letter about the Cattleya genus that ran to 6 pages. Her father replied with 9. They corresponded for the rest of their lives, and Lady Maud read their letters aloud over breakfast on Tuesday mornings, and declared them the finest ongoing publication in the whole of Yorkshire. And in the conservatory at Aldermere Hall, in the long winter mornings when the light came slow and silver through the glass panels and the camellias held their careful blooms and the orchids on the east wall bore, at last, their correct names. The Earl and his Countess worked side by side, in the particular silence that is not absence but completion, among the specimens that had been mislabeled for years, and were finally carefully truly seen. She had been sent to Yorkshire for the wrong man. She had found the right one. Not by luck, not by arrangement, but because she looked, because she had always looked, and because he had already been looking, and because 2 people who see clearly, truly clearly, the way you recognize a mislabeled thing for exactly what it is, tend to find each other out when they are placed in the same room long enough and given the grace of sufficient silence. That, my dear friends, is the story I came to tell you tonight. The story of a woman who was sent somewhere for one purpose and arrived somewhere else entirely, and had the great good sense to recognize it when she got there. Come back to the fire. Subscribe to Moonlight at Marlowe and stay with us. Every story in this house is Heroine. Every ending is the one that was deserved.